A man is found dead in a locked cabin. The ship's doctor says it was a heart attack. But Dr. Selene Avara smells something in the wine glass that no heart attack leaves behind. Someone on this ship poisoned Lord Edmond Strahl. And when Selene uncovers who, she discovers something far more disturbing than the murder itself. The killer had every reason to do it. 23 people died because of Strahl 30 years ago. The law protected him then. The law would have protected him forever. Now Selene holds the evidence. She can hand the killer to the authorities. Or she can ask herself the question that changes everything. Is stopping a murderer still the right thing to do, when the victim deserved it? Poison on the Adriana. Chapter 1, The Fog of Istanbul. The fog rolled off the Bosphorus like smoke from a fire that had been burning for centuries. It moved slowly, indifferently, swallowing the lower decks of the SS Adriana as the ship eased away from the Galata docks. Dr. Selene Avara stood at the stern railing and watched Istanbul dissolve into grey. She was not watching for pleasure. She had already catalogued every passenger who had boarded in the last 2 hours, noted every piece of luggage loaded into the first-class hold, and she needed somewhere to direct her eyes while she organized what she had observed. She was 37 years old. 9 years at the International Criminal Court in The Hague had made her into a particular kind of professional, one who built cases from evidence that other people preferred not to examine. Her reports were meticulous and occasionally career-ending for those who had expected their actions to go undocumented. A dispute with a senior prosecutor over the suppression of inconvenient findings had ended her appointment 2 years earlier. Since then she had consulted privately, taking cases that were interesting and clients who were honest enough to tell her what they actually needed. She was brilliant without apology and difficult without embarrassment, 2 qualities that made her good at her work and not especially easy to be around. She had boarded the SS Adriana on the strength of a contract from a Swiss insurance firm that wanted her to review a decade-old maritime claim. The voyage was 4 days, Istanbul to Marseille. She had a first-class cabin, a leather briefcase containing 3 case files and 2 novels she would probably not open, and an expectation of arriving rested. She did not expect Lord Edmond Strahl to be dead before the ship reached open water. She had first seen him at the boarding gate, which was not difficult. He was 64 years old, silver-haired with the kind of precision that money buys for the appearance of effortless distinction. He moved through the crowd with the ease of a man who had never once considered that a space might not open for him, because it always had. He spoke to people with a warmth calibrated precisely to pass as genuine among those not paying attention. Selene placed him in a category she used for individuals who had built power through a combination of intelligence and moral flexibility, and returned her attention to the queue. She had also noticed the others. Baroness Mira Kastner, Hungarian by origin, perhaps 57, stood at the gate with a stillness so complete it registered as a physical presence. She had positioned herself to maintain a clear line of sight to Strahl without appearing to watch him. She wore a dark grey wool coat and a single oval enamel brooch. Her face belonged to someone who had arrived at a conclusion long ago and had spent the years since simply waiting for events to catch up. Dr. Cormac Heel was the ship's physician, listed on the manifest Selene had requested from her client's travel agent the week before. She made it a habit to review ship rosters before any voyage. He was 48, heavy-set, with a nervous sociability that had become habitual rather than natural, the coping mechanism of a man who had learned that warmth deflected scrutiny. He greeted Lord Strahl at the gangway with a handshake that lasted a beat too long and a smile with nothing behind it. Piers Nosant was listed as a journalist, 43 years old, traveling alone. He had sat in the departure lounge for 40 minutes with a notebook open on his knee and had not written a single word. He looked at Lord Strahl exactly twice, each time for precisely long enough to confirm what he was already looking for. And then there was Captain Elias Vaughan, who greeted the first-class passengers at the top of the gangway with practiced maritime hospitality, a performance so polished it had separated itself from any actual feeling. He was 62, French-Swiss, with grey eyes set in a face that had weathered a great many years at sea and revealed very little about what those years had cost him. Selene filed all of this in the part of her mind she kept for information that had not yet revealed its relevance. Then she went to her cabin, reviewed the insurance file for 2 hours, and dressed for the captain's dinner. Chapter 2: The Captain's Table. The first-class dining room of the SS Adriana had been designed in the 1920s for controlled magnificence. Dark wood panels, brass fixtures, white linen that felt both intimate and formal at the same time. The lighting was warm and deliberate. The whole room was an argument for civilized pleasure of the kind that required money to access and refinement to appreciate. Selene arrived 7 minutes after the stated hour, late enough to observe the room in motion but not so late as to draw attention. She wore dark green silk and chose a seat at the second table where she had a clear view of the captain's table without being at it. Strahl occupied the captain's right, which was exactly where he would have arranged to be placed. He performed charm with the focused energy of someone who treated social interactions as exercises in dominance conducted at a pleasant pitch. He refilled his wine glass twice before the first course arrived. He produced a business card and handed it to the woman on his left in a way that was almost certainly unnecessary but that gave him the opportunity to touch her wrist. He laughed at something Captain Vaughan said without quite looking at him, the laugh of a man acknowledging a performance rather than responding to it. Baroness Kastner sat at the far end of the captain's table and did not speak unless spoken to, which happened 3 times during the meal. Each time she answered briefly and returned her attention to her food. She did not look at Strahl. Not once in 2 hours did she turn her eyes in his direction, and that studied absence of attention was more deliberate than staring would have been. Dr. Hill sat at Selene's table, which she noted. The ship's physician would normally eat at the captain's table on a vessel of this class. He ate with the secondary passengers, drank wine he did not appear to taste, and spoke to the couple beside him about port itineraries with the fluency of someone delivering a memorized script. Piers nosed ate alone at a corner table and spoke to no one. He ordered a single glass of wine, drank half of it, and spent the meal reading from a document holder propped against a water carafe. From the density of the text and the small notations he made in the margins, Selene guessed it was research rather than pleasure reading. The dinner ran through 4 courses. Selene spoke with the Belgian couple beside her, architects on holiday who told her more about contemporary residential design trends than she needed to know. She watched the room. Near the end of the evening she saw the thing that mattered. Strahl, rising from his seat, leaned close to Captain Vaughan and said something brief. Vaughan's expression did not change. This was worth noting. Most people register some reaction when someone leans close and speaks privately at the end of a dinner, some small flicker of curiosity or amusement. Vaughan registered nothing. His face held the neutrality of a man who had already heard what was being said and had already decided how to respond to it. Strahl laughed, touched Vaughan on the shoulder, and left. Vaughan watched him go with the same stillness Selene had observed in Baroness Kastner. Then he turned to another passenger and his face arranged itself back into the performance of hospitality. Selene finished her wine and thought about stillness, and about what 2 very different people were doing with it. Chapter 3: The Locked Door. She was awakened at 7:22 the following morning by a knock that tried to be firm and apologetic at the same time. She was dressed and at the door within 40 seconds. The steward, Arnaud, was 26 and handled first-class service with the focused competence of someone who took his work seriously. He was also, at this moment, breathing with the careful deliberateness of a person who had recently encountered something upsetting and was managing it through technique rather than instinct. He told her, quietly, that Dr. Hill had sent him and that there was a situation involving one of the first-class cabins and that Dr. Hill believed her professional experience might be useful. She followed him. Cabin A7 was at the end of the corridor, port side, one of the 3 largest cabins on the first-class deck. The door was open, which meant someone had already used the master key. Dr. Hill stood near the window in the manner of someone who had placed himself out of the way to emphasize that he was not the person responsible for what had happened here. Lord Edmond Strahl was in the armchair beside the writing desk. He still wore the evening clothes from dinner, jacket buttoned, a slight lean to the left suggesting he had relaxed into the chair and never moved again. A glass of red wine sat on the desk beside him, roughly 2/3 empty. His color was wrong, bluish at the lips, and his hands rested with a looseness entirely different from natural sleep. Selene put on her examination gloves and began. She did not speak to Heel during this because speech would have divided her attention. No pulse. The skin temperature and early lividity pattern at the neck and hands, but the time of death between midnight and 2 in the morning. She examined the position of the body, the hands, the face, the angle of the head. She looked at the glass. She looked at the burgundy bottle on the desk, half empty, the cork loosely replaced beside it. The window was the sealed non-opening type standard on this deck. She looked at the door. The door operated on a standard lever bolt mechanism. The bolt was a horizontal bar that dropped into a catch on the frame when the handle was turned from the inside. From the outside, the keyhole accepted the master key but not any guest key. The bolt showed no damage. The frame showed no damage. The door had been genuinely locked from the inside, or locked to appear that way. She crouched beside the door frame and looked at the gap between the door and the floor. A half-centimeter clearance, uniform. She ran her finger along the base of the door and found, at the far left corner of the door edge, a faint scratch in the lacquer that was not consistent with ordinary use. It was a precise line, the kind left by something thin and rigid passed repeatedly through a narrow gap at a controlled angle. She understood immediately. A thin rod, stiff cord, or length of fine wire inserted through the floor gap and used to manipulate the lever bolt from the outside by threading the instrument around and under the handle mechanism. Not a common method. Not a civilian method. It required knowledge of the bolt geometry, steadiness of hand, and practice. The kind of method taught to people who needed to create the appearance of locked rooms. She rose and leaned close to the rim of the wine glass. The scent was faint. Organic. Green in a way no grape variety produced. Slightly alkaline. She had encountered it once before, in a toxicology seminar in Lyon 11 years earlier, in a case study involving a mountaineering death that had proven to be homicide. The presenting pathologist had called it one of the most considered poisons in the pharmacological literature. Aconitine. Derived from Aconitum napellus, monkshood. Colorless in solution. Essentially odorless at lethal concentrations. It dissolved completely in full-bodied red wine. Fatal dose, 2 to 5 milligrams, inducing cardiac arrhythmia and respiratory failure within 60 to 120 minutes. Death would appear, to any physician not specifically screening for alkaloids, consistent with myocardial infarction. Strahl had a documented history of mild hypertension and elevated cholesterol, both managed by medication. His personal physician had cleared him for travel. His arterial history was precisely the kind that would lead most pathologists, without specific instruction otherwise, to record cardiac arrest and close the file. Selene rose, removed her gloves, and turned to face Dr. Heel. She told him she agreed with a preliminary assessment of natural causes pending a full report. She asked that the cabin remain sealed and that the captain be notified. She said she would be available to assist with documentation. Heel looked relieved in the way of a man who has been holding himself very still for a long time and has just been told he can stop. He said of course, naturally, very kind of her. He left. She walked back to her cabin, sat at the writing desk, opened her notebook, and wrote 4 names. She studied them. Then she wrote a 5th. She had been on the ship less than 18 hours. The Adriana would reach Marseille in 3 days. The body was in a sealed cabin. The poison would not declare itself in any standard post-mortem without specific direction. The scratch on the door frame would mean nothing to someone who did not already know what to look for. She had 3 days to build a case that was complete before they docked. Chapter 4, The Journalist. She found Piers Nosant on the port deck at 9:15, leaning against the railing with his notebook. The Mediterranean was grey-green in the morning light, restless in the way of early spring. He did not look surprised to see her, which meant he had been aware of her approach for some time. She sat in the deck chair beside him without asking. She told him she was a forensic pathologist who had examined Lord Strahl's body that morning and that she was trying to understand the circumstances before the ship reached Marseille. She offered no softening preamble because softening preambles wasted time. Nozent studied her briefly. He had the evaluating quality of a good journalist, the ability to take stock of a situation without committing to a position on it. He apparently decided she was worth engaging, because he closed the notebook. He had been following Lord Edmond Strahl for 4 months. He told it in the way a journalist tells a story carried too long, methodically, the careful sequence of someone who has organized facts so many times the sequence has become automatic. Strahl had served in a senior advisory role to the British government in the 1990s. In 1994 he sat on a small committee with access to classified Allied deployment schedules in the Balkans, specifically the movements of Allied intelligence units operating under NATO agreements. In September of that year, a combined unit in eastern Bosnia was ambushed. 23 people died, including 3 French national agents and 14 Allied support personnel. The ambush was too precise to have succeeded without advance knowledge of the unit's route and timing, information that could only have come from the deployment schedules. An inquiry had been opened. It had found insufficient evidence to proceed to prosecution. This had required a series of redirections and procedural interventions that Nozent described with the measured language of someone who had documentation for each step and was choosing words with legal care. Strahl was 4 years into what became a distinguished career in the House of Lords. He was not charged. The inquiry was closed. Nozent had spent 4 months rebuilding the evidentiary foundation of that inquiry using financial records made accessible through subsequent European transparency legislation. The records pointed to a payment routed through corporate structures to a private account traceable, through several layers, to Strahl. The source of the payment connected to the arms broker who had supplied the forces responsible for the ambush. She asked about the notebook he was always carrying. He said it was not a working notebook. It was a reminder list. He had stopped bringing research materials anywhere they might be observed after Strahl's lawyers obtained an injunction against a previous article, and 2 of his research files disappeared from his hotel room during a conference in Brussels. The disappearance was never explained. The timing was not coincidental. She asked if there was anything else relevant to the current situation. He paused. Then he said that 6 months earlier, Strahl's lawyers had sent a package to his editor containing evidence of a source fabrication Nozent had committed 8 years ago. A named source in a published story had not existed. The story had been true in substance but built, at one critical juncture, on an invented person. The evidence was genuine. Nozent said this plainly, without trying to explain it away. The editor had been told privately that if the Strahl investigation story was published, the fabrication would be submitted to the press regulatory body. No written threat existed. No complaint was possible. He said he had spent 6 months deciding what to do and had concluded the story was more important than his career, which was easier to believe in the abstract than in practice. She thanked him and left. Chapter 5, The Baroness. The Baroness Mira Kastner was in the upper deck reading lounge with a book open on her lap that she was not reading. She looked up when Selene entered and showed no surprise. Selene sat across from her and said what she had said to Nozent, briefly. The Baroness closed her book and placed it on the table between them. She had the manner of someone who had been waiting a long time for a conversation that was only now becoming possible. She said she had known the voyage would end this way since she received an envelope 2 weeks before departure. It had arrived at her Budapest apartment with no return address. The postmark was Zurich. Inside was a photocopy of a bank transfer record. 300,000 euros, routed from a Liechtenstein shell company to a second shell company registered in the Isle of Man. The notations in the margin, written by hand, traced the originating account through 2 intermediary structures to a source identifiable, to someone who knew how to read such documents, as connected to Lord Edmond Strahl. Accompanying the photocopy was a single typed line: "He will board the SS Adriana in Istanbul on the 14th. Bring this to whoever is in a position to use it." No signature. Selene asked who had sent it. The Baroness said she had not known for certain when she boarded. She said her husband, Jovan Kastner, had been a communications analyst seconded to the Allied unit ambushed in Bosnia in September 1994. He had been 31 years old. They had been married for 4 years. She had been told he died quickly and did not suffer. She had known immediately that this was something people said because they believed it was kind rather than because they had any evidence for it. She said she had spent 30 years knowing what had happened and watching the mechanisms designed to address it fail. She was not a vengeful person. She did not feel vengeance. She felt something colder and more durable, the sensation of a fact that refuses burial regardless of how much institutional convenience is piled on top of it. She had boarded the ship because the envelope told her to, and because she had trusted that the voyage would produce the right person to give the document to. She looked at Selene when she said this with the directness of someone making an accurate calculation rather than expressing a hope. Selene asked if she had had any prior contact with Captain Vaughan. The Baroness paused for exactly the length of time required to confirm the question was the correct one. Then she said she had never met Captain Vaughan directly. But she said that whoever had sent the envelope had known 3 things simultaneously: Strahl's travel itinerary, the value of the financial documents, and that someone aboard the Adriana would be in a position to use them. The number of people who could have known all 3 of those things was very small. She looked at Selene steadily. She did not say the name. She did not need to. Selene thanked her. The Baroness nodded once with the precision of someone closing a chapter, and opened her book. Chapter 6, The Doctor's Silence. She found Dr. Heel in the medical bay at 2 in the afternoon, reorganizing supply cabinets with the focused energy of someone who needed to do something with their hands. He did not hear her enter. When she spoke his name, he turned and she watched several things happen on his face in sequence: the instinct toward professional composure, the assessment that composure might not hold, and then a settling, the expression of a man who has been bracing for a long time and has just decided to stop. She told him she knew about the Aconitine. He sat on the edge of the examination table and put his hands in his lap and looked at them. She said she had identified the compound from the residue in the glass and that she knew he had recognized it at the initial examination and that she needed to understand the sequence of events before she could understand anything else. He told her the sequence without minimizing his own part in it, which she respected. He had recognized the Aconitine at the initial examination. The compound was covered in depth in the forensic toxicology component of his medical training, primarily because its symptom profile so closely mimicked cardiac arrest and its detection required a deliberate decision to look for it. He had detected the same faint alkaline note she had. He had known what it was. He had looked at Strahl in the chair and thought about 11 years. He had become Strahl's ship's physician 6 voyages ago under an arrangement he had not sought. Strahl had obtained documentation of a prescription error Hill made in 2011. A patient had been prescribed a drug at a dosage contraindicated by a second medication the patient had not disclosed. No harm resulted. The error was never reported. But the documentation existed, and Strahl had referenced it once, briefly, in a context that could not be recorded as a threat but communicated everything that needed communicating. Heel had understood the structure immediately. He had accepted the arrangement and had told himself, each voyage, that it would be the last. When he smelled the Aconitine, he had looked at the dead man and thought, someone has done what the institutions could not do, or would not do. He had made a decision he was not proud of and not entirely ashamed of, and that he understood constituted criminal complicity. Selene told him his silence had made him an accessory after the fact and that she required his full cooperation. She told him she was not in a position to offer immunity from the consequences of that decision, but that his cooperation would be relevant to how those consequences were understood by the authorities. He said he understood and would cooperate fully. He said it with the relief of someone finally permitted to put down a heavy object. She asked him to prepare a complete clinical report of his initial examination, including everything he had actually observed, without the adjustments he had made to his first assessment. He agreed without hesitation and began writing before she left the room. Chapter 7: The Captain's Log. She requested the ship's service logs from Arnaud, who had by this point adopted a policy of giving Selene whatever she asked for on the understanding that this was the professionally correct posture. He produced the logs in 30 minutes, 4 days of entries, neatly compiled, covering all sections of the vessel. She read them in her cabin over 2 hours. The logs were maintained with maritime thoroughness, each entry timed and initialed, each departure from routine justified. They told her a great deal about the ordinary operations of the SS Adriana and one thing about something else. Captain Elias Vaughan had logged a personal inspection of the first-class luggage hold at 11:40 on the evening before departure from Istanbul. The justification given was routine pre-departure security check, a category that existed in the log's notation system and was therefore formally legitimate. She had spent enough years with documentation to recognize the difference between a record that describes what happened and a record that constructs a description. The first has organic variation, the small irregularities of handwriting produced by different levels of attention and the natural translation of thought into language under pressure. The second has a subtle uniformity, the deliberateness of someone writing with an awareness that what they write will be read. The 1140 entry had that quality. It would not have registered to anyone not specifically looking for it. But it had been written by someone composing a record rather than keeping one. She also noted that no prior personal luggage hold inspection by the captain appeared in any of the 4 previous voyage records included in the file. Possible but not routine. She spent the rest of the afternoon cross-referencing the passenger manifest, the crew manifest, and the supply manifest. The Burgundy wine in Strahl's cabin had been listed on the supply manifest as a personal provision submitted with his travel documentation, a standard arrangement for first-class passengers on extended voyages. It had been loaded in Istanbul as part of the first-class personal luggage consignment, supervised by the first officer and the luggage master. At the bottom of that page, in a hand different from the rest of the page, was a notation: Captain informed of all personal provisions in first-class hold prior to departure. This notation appeared in none of the 4 previous voyage records. She closed the logs and sat with what she had. The scratch on the door frame. The Aconitine in the wine glass. The pre-departure inspection of the hold. The notation about personal provisions. The anonymous envelope postmarked Zurich. These were not separate facts. They were a sequence. And the sequence pointed to one person on this ship who had the knowledge, the access, and 30 years of reason. Chapter 8: The Night Conversation. She sent a message through Arnaud requesting a meeting with Captain Vaughan at 9 that evening, stating she had questions related to the documentation of Lord Strahl's death for the Marseille authorities. The meeting was arranged for the captain's day cabin adjacent to the bridge. The room was spare and functional. Nautical charts on one wall, a marine radio on the desk, 2 chairs facing each other across a small table. Vaughan poured coffee without asking whether she wanted it and sat across from her with the ease of a man who had conducted thousands of conversations in rooms like this and was comfortable with whatever this one might contain. She laid out what she had found. In sequence, without drama, evidence stated before conclusion. The Aconitine and how she had identified it. The scratch at the base of the door frame and what it indicated. The pre-departure inspection entry in the log and what distinguished it from the surrounding entries. The personal provisions notation that appeared on no previous voyage. The bank transfer document held by Baroness Kastner. The connection between Strahl and the 1994 ambush that Nozent's research had built over 4 months. The 30-year sequence of institutional failure. She also told him what the Baroness had said without saying, that the anonymous envelope had been sent by someone who simultaneously knew Strahl's travel plans, understood the value of the financial documents, and knew that a person aboard the Adriana would be positioned to use them. That the number of people who knew all 3 of those things was very small. That she had arrived at the number 1. Vaughan listened. He was entirely still throughout. When she finished, he looked at his coffee cup for a long moment. Then he told her his story. He had been a French intelligence officer from 1986 to 1996, working primarily in the Balkans during the Yugoslav conflicts. He had known the Allied unit ambushed in Bosnia in September 1994 not through the institutional chain of command, but in the way that field personnel come to know each other, built from shared risk and mutual dependency rather than organizational hierarchy. Among the 23 people who died in that ambush was a woman named Elise Marchand. She had been 26 years old. She was the most skilled intelligence analyst he had worked with in a career that had given him access to a great many skilled people. She was meticulous, creative, precise. She had the rare capacity to distinguish between what evidence actually indicated and what you wanted it to indicate, which in intelligence work, as in most fields, was not a common quality. She had been, he said, one of the finest people he had known. He had left French intelligence in 1996. An institution that had closed an inquiry into 23 deaths because of political considerations was not one he could continue to serve. He had spent the following 15 years in maritime work, which suited him. Navigation offered problems that were precisely defined and answers that were either correct or incorrect, with very little room for the kind of institutional interpretation that had destroyed his faith in the other kind of work. He had not planned what he did in the way a plan is usually constructed. The intention had accumulated in pieces over 30 years, the weight of knowing something and watching the mechanisms designed to address it fail in sequence. When Strahl's name appeared on the manifest for the Istanbul departure, something in him recognized the moment without quite deciding to. He spent 3 weeks determining what he was willing to do. He had sourced the Aconitine through a contact in Istanbul who asked no questions. He had identified the specific Burgundy vintage from Strahl's customs declaration, cross-referenced it with the supply manifest, and introduced the compound into one of the bottles in the sealed case during his inspection of the hold at 11:40. He had relied on Strahl's known habit of opening personal provisions immediately rather than requesting ship service. He had been right. He had sent the envelope to Baroness Kastner because he had located her 3 years earlier in the course of his own research into the ambush. She had the financial document through a contact of her own in the European Transparency Network. He had not told her what he intended to do. He had told her only to bring the document to the person who could use it. He had wanted the evidence to reach the light regardless of what happened to him afterward. That was the only thing he was entirely certain about. He said he had not expected a forensic pathologist to be among the passengers. He said this without complaint, as a fact. Selene asked him the question she had been preparing since she first saw the log entry. She asked whether he believed what he had done was right. He was quiet for a time. The ship moved around them. The ocean at night made small sounds against the hull and the engines ran below everything else like a low continuous note. He said he did not use the word right. He was not certain it applied cleanly. He had believed it was the only action remaining after every other action had been exhausted. He still believed that. He did not say it with satisfaction. He said it the way a person describes a medical procedure they did not want but understood to be necessary. He looked at her with the steadiness of someone who had already accepted the consequence of this conversation and was simply waiting for it to arrive. Chapter 9, The Choice on the Water. She sat with what he had said for a long time after he finished. She had learned, across 9 years of building cases from evidence, that the most important moments were not the moments of revelation but the moments immediately after, when you were required to decide what to do with what you had found. She thought about Jovan Kastner, 31 years old, in a field in eastern Bosnia, in September 1994, not coming home. She thought about Elise Marchand, 26 years old, meticulous and gifted, who had died because someone with access to a classified document had decided the document had a market value. Who had been incapable, by Vaughan's account, of the kind of convenience that had killed her. She thought about Piers Nosant and a story suppressed for 6 months by the threat of personal destruction, and about the 8 years before that during which it had never quite been possible to publish the truth in a form that could not be dismantled by lawyers. She thought about Dr. Heal, who had spent 11 years compelled and afraid, and about the architecture of leverage that Strahl had built and maintained with what appeared to be very little effort. She thought about 30 years of inquiry, redirection, procedural adjustment, and institutional management that had preserved Lord Edmond Strahl's reputation and liberty while the people he had harmed remained without resolution. And then she thought about something else. She thought about all the cases she had worked in which the logic of private justice had appeared, in various forms, always clear and justified to the person exercising it, always the last available option from the inside. She thought about what her work had taught her about certainty, which was that it was precisely the condition in which error was most dangerous and least visible. Not because certainty was always wrong, but because it required no external check, no verification, no possibility of correction. Certainty was a closed system. And closed systems were where the worst errors lived. The formal mechanisms of inquiry, with their procedural safeguards and evidentiary rules and requirements of documentation, were not only designed to find wrongdoing. They were designed to prevent any individual from appointing themselves the arbiter of which wrongdoing merited punishment and what punishment it deserved. They were designed with an awareness that grief, and righteous conviction, and 30 years of accumulated institutional failure, were all capable of producing in a reasonable person the feeling that they alone were positioned to administer justice, and that this feeling, however sincerely arrived at, was itself the mechanism of a particular category of error, one with no appeal. A world in which individuals administered death according to their own moral accounting was not a world in which justice was more reliably achieved. It was a world in which every sufficiently certain person became a potential executioner. And the most dangerous feature of that world was not its extreme possibilities but its ordinary ones, that each executioner would have excellent reasons, and the reasons would always feel adequate from the inside. She thought about Elise Marchand again. Vaughan had said she was incapable of the kind of convenience that killed her. She verified everything. She never claimed to know something she only suspected. Selene understood this not as a description of a quality but of a practice. Something enacted continuously and specifically rather than held as an abstract commitment. The practice of making things visible to more than one set of eyes. Of converting private knowledge into something that could be examined, contested, and corrected. Of inserting into every chain of events a stage that required external verification rather than internal certainty alone. She told Vaughan she would be filing a complete and accurate report with the French maritime authorities upon arrival in Marseille. She told him it would include her clinical findings, her toxicological assessment, the door frame evidence, the log analysis, and the full documentation that Baroness Kastner was carrying. She told him that Nozent's research, combined with the bank transfer record and her forensic documentation, constituted a case with a realistic prospect of producing legal proceedings against Strahl's estate and associates, proceedings that the previous inquiry had been structured to prevent. She told him she understood the distance between legal accountability and the full accounting that justice in any complete sense required. She was not claiming sufficiency. She was making a claim about what she was unwilling to participate in, which was the extension of institutional silence by one more careful professional who had noticed something and chose not to document it. Vaughan looked at her. He said he had understood, from the moment he saw her put on her examination gloves in that cabin with the focused precision of someone about to find exactly what was there to find, that the outcome would be this one. She asked if he had anything to add to the record before she completed it. He said, "Elise Marchand was 26 years old and was the most careful person I ever worked with. She verified everything. She never claimed to know something she only suspected. She was incapable of the kind of convenience that killed her." He said, "I wanted her death to mean something. I thought this was how." He did not say anything else. She left the bridge at 11:15. The ship moved through the dark Mediterranean. She could feel the engines through the floor of the corridor, steady and indifferent, carrying all of them toward Marseille at a speed that would not change regardless of what had happened in the cabins above the waterline. Chapter 10, Marseille. The SS Adriana docked in Marseille on a Tuesday morning in early March. The harbour was cold and clear, the light off the water blue-white with the thin brightness of late winter. The French maritime police were on the dock when the gangway descended, notified by a transmission Selene had asked the radio officer to send the previous evening, which he had done after a brief exchange with Captain Vaughan that she had not been present for. She had spent the last night of the voyage at her writing desk, organizing her notes into the format she used for court submissions. Findings in sequence. Evidence cited and numbered. Conclusions separated cleanly from inferences. Inferences separated clearly from speculation. She had included everything: the Aconitine, the door frame scratch, the log entry, the luggage hold notation, the timeline, the bank transfer record photographed with Baroness Kastner's permission, the history of the 1994 inquiry and its redirections drawn from Nozant's research. The clinical report Dr. Heel had prepared overnight was thorough and honest, and would cost him professionally. He had produced it without hesitation. Captain Vaughan cooperated fully with the maritime police. He was taken from the ship at 9:40 in the morning, formally arrested on suspicion of unlawful killing, and conveyed to the Marseille police judiciaire. He walked off the ship without assistance, in his uniform, carrying nothing. Selene watched from the upper deck and did not mistake composure for an absence of consequence. Piers Nozant filed his story 3 days later through a London publication that had legal structures in place for precisely this kind of material, arrangements that insulated it from the injunction mechanisms that had been used against him before. The story ran at 17,000 words, with documentation. It was not the story he had intended to write, the one about a living man evading accountability. It became instead a story about 30 years of institutional failure, told through documents. Documents, it turned out, were more durable than a man who could deploy lawyers. The parliamentary inquiry formally reopened 11 weeks after that. Strahl's estate filed objections. The estate's lawyers made the arguments available to them, the standard arguments of posthumous reputation and circumstantial connection. Some of those arguments had legal merit. None of them addressed what the documents showed. Baroness Kastner returned to Budapest by train on the afternoon of arrival. She did not speak to the press. She had been asked by the investigating police to remain available for interview and had agreed to be reached by telephone. She had done what the envelope asked her to do. She had carried the document onto the ship and delivered it to the right person. She had been a witness, and a precise one, and she understood that this was the most useful thing she could have been. Dr. Heel was referred to the General Medical Council. The matter was characterized in his clinical report as a failure of professional judgment under duress. The outcome of that process was not one Selene could predict or control, and she did not attempt to. She flew from Marseille to Amsterdam on a Tuesday afternoon and slept on the plane, which she almost never managed. She arrived at Schiphol at dusk. The city was cold and lit in the way of northern cities in early spring, a light that offered clarity rather than warmth. She took a taxi to her apartment, made coffee with the careful attention she gave to the preparation of coffee, which was one of the few domestic acts she performed with something resembling pleasure, and sat at her desk. The insurance file from the Swiss firm was still there. She had not looked at it since Istanbul. She opened it, found her place, and began reading. She thought, briefly, about what Vaughan had said about Elise Marchand. She verified everything. She never claimed to know something she only suspected. Selene had understood this not as a quality a person was born with but as a practice they chose and maintained every day under conditions that made it inconvenient. Not certainty, which was self-confirming and closed. Not the assertion of what you knew, but the demonstrated chain between evidence and conclusion, available for anyone to examine and dispute and correct. Not justice as a private moral calculation that one sufficiently certain person could administer alone. But justice as a continuous, imperfect, externally verifiable process in which each accurately documented fact was a brick placed into something larger than any single case, larger than any single person's grief or righteous conviction or 30 years of waiting. It was not a comfortable practice. It produced results that were slow and incomplete and sometimes inadequate to the scale of what they addressed. It did not restore what had been lost. It did not give 30 years back to the people who had spent them without answers. It did not produce the satisfaction that Captain Vaughan had sought and, by his own account, had not entirely found. But it was the practice that had made it possible for Baroness Kastner to carry a document onto a ship and find the right person to give it to. It was the practice that had made Nozant's 17,000 words publishable after 6 months of suppression. It was the practice that had made it possible for a forensic pathologist to detect the faint alkaline trace of aconitine in a wine glass on a ship in the Mediterranean and follow the chain of evidence from that single observation to a complete account that could be placed before people whose responsibility it was to act. The work was not everything, the work was not nothing. She turned a page of the insurance file and continued reading.